Let me start with something that almost no one says out loud. Some people don't go quiet because they have nothing to say. They go quiet because they've learned that saying anything at all only makes things worse. It starts small. You notice them pause before responding. You notice they agree a little too quickly. You notice they change the subject instead of defending themselves. And then, in the middle of what should be a real conversation, they just stop. No raised voice, no rebuttal, no tears, just silence. And from the outside, it looks like indifference. It looks like they don't care enough to fight. It looks like emotional withdrawal, or worse, manipulation. But from the inside, it feels like the only safe option left.
People who go silent during conflict are often misread as cold, passive-aggressive, or emotionally unavailable. But the truth is usually far more complicated, far more layered, and far more painful than most people realize. Because that silence isn't emptiness. It's a response. It's a pattern. It's a history. And it didn't come from nowhere. Most of these people didn't choose silence as a strategy. They arrived at it after something else stopped working. Maybe they tried to explain and were interrupted. Maybe they expressed hurt and were told they were too sensitive. Maybe they raised their voice once and it was used against them for years. Maybe they stayed calm and were accused of not caring. So, over time, they ran out of approaches that felt safe, and silence became the only one that didn't cost them something.
Psychologically speaking, this behavior is often rooted in what's called a conditioned shutdown response. It's not a decision made in the moment. It's a pattern the nervous system learned, sometimes in childhood, sometimes in past relationships, that conflict equals danger. Not danger in a dramatic sense, but danger in the quiet sense. The kind where your words get twisted, where your emotions get weaponized, where being honest means being vulnerable in front of someone who isn't safe to be vulnerable with. One of the core psychological mechanisms behind going silent is something called the freeze response. Most people know about fight or flight, but there is a third response the body reaches for when neither fighting nor fleeing feels possible. It freezes.
The mind goes still. The words disappear. Not because the person has nothing to feel, but because the system has been overwhelmed and is shut down to protect itself. This is not a choice. This is biology. And for people who grew up in environments where conflict was unpredictable, explosive, or punishing, the freeze response becomes the default setting. The brain learns when tension rises, become still. Don't engage. Don't escalate. Don't give them more to use. And that lesson, once learned early, becomes almost automatic.
There's another layer to this that rarely gets talked about. Many people who go silent during arguments are not disengaged, they are over-engaged. While they appear calm on the outside, their internal world is anything but. They are replaying what just happened. They are processing every word that was said. They are anticipating every possible outcome of speaking. They are managing their own emotional response so that it doesn't come out in a way they'll regret. This is called emotional hyperprocessing, and it is exhausting in a way that's invisible to everyone else. The person who looks unbothered in an argument is often the one lying awake at 2 a.m, running the entire conversation through their head, wondering if they should have said something, wondering if it would have made any difference, wondering if the other person even understands what just happened.
There's also a deep connection between going silent and what psychologists call learned helplessness. This happens when someone has repeatedly tried to communicate, tried to express their needs, their hurt, their perspective,
and been met with dismissal, escalation, or punishment. After enough of those experiences, the brain stops expecting communication to work. Not because the person has given up on the relationship, but because they've run the experiment enough times to know how it ends. They speak, they are misunderstood, they clarify, it gets worse. They stay quiet, it eventually passes. So silence stops being a failure to communicate. It starts being a reasonable prediction based on prior evidence. What makes this pattern so painful is that it tends to backfire. When someone goes silent, the other person often reads it as rejection, as control, as cruelty. So they push harder. They raise their voice. They say something designed to provoke a reaction. And the silent person retreats further. Because now, not only is the original conflict unresolved, there's a new layer of hurt layered on top of it, and no one is talking about any of it. Psychologically, this creates what's called a pursuer-withdrawer dynamic. One person chases the conversation, the other disappears from it. Neither person feels heard, both people feel abandoned. And the longer it goes on, the more calcified the pattern becomes. Something important to understand about people who go silent is that many of them deeply value peace. Not the false kind of peace, not the kind where problems are swept under the surface and left to rot, but genuine peace, emotional safety, calm. They are often the people who carry tension in their chest for days, who feel physical discomfort at raised voices, who grew up in homes where conflict was loud and unpredictable, and learned to associate silence with survival. For them, staying quiet isn't avoidance, it is regulation. It is the way they keep themselves from saying something they'll regret. It is the way they stop an argument from becoming something they can't come back from. It is, in its own way, an act of protection, sometimes for themselves, and sometimes for the person they're in conflict with. There's also a quiet shame that lives inside people like this. Because they know what they look like from the outside. They know they seem checked out. They know their silence reads as not caring. And that perception that the person who cares most deeply comes across as the one who cares least is one of the loneliest feelings there is. They want to explain. They want to say, I'm not cold. I'm overwhelmed. I'm not done. I'm protecting us. I'm not absent. I'm trying not to make this worse. But explaining that in the middle of a conflict feels impossible, because the moment they open their mouth, they're back inside the thing they were trying to manage. Here's something rarely acknowledged. People who go silent are often some of the most sensitive people in the room. Not sensitive in the fragile sense, sensitive in the way that means they feel everything more acutely. They notice the shift in tone before the words change. They register the tension in someone's jaw before a single syllable is spoken. They pick up on emotional undercurrents that most people miss entirely. And because they feel conflict so intensely, silence becomes the only volume they can turn it down to. Another key psychological factor is identity preservation. For many people who go silent, speaking during conflict doesn't just feel risky. It feels like potential self-erasure. They know, from experience, what happens to their words when emotions are running high. Their words get taken out of context. Their intentions get misinterpreted. Their vulnerability gets turned into a weapon. So rather than risk losing themselves in the argument, rather than risk saying something that becomes the new story about who they are, they say nothing. Because nothing cannot be misquoted. Nothing cannot be used against them later. Nothing
is the only thing that stays completely theirs. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Silence protects, but it also imprisons. The same stillness that keeps someone safe in the moment keeps them unknown in the relationship. People who chronically go silent often describe a growing sense of invisible distance, even from people they love. They're present, they're engaged, they care deeply, but they've learned to keep the most important parts of themselves just out of reach. And over time, this creates a strange kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being misunderstood by people who think they know you.
Psychologically, this pattern also creates something called emotional compression. When feelings have nowhere to go, they don't disappear, they compress. The hurt from an unspoken argument doesn't resolve. It layers on top of the hurt from the last one, and the one before that. And eventually, the compressed weight of all those unspoken moments begins to change things quietly. Affection becomes distance. Patience becomes numbness. Love starts to feel like effort. Not because the feeling left, but because there was never a safe enough space to put it down.
There's also something worth naming about the grief inside this pattern. People who go silent often grieve the version of themselves who used to speak more freely. The version who hadn't yet learned to be careful, who said things before they knew how they could land, who trusted that words were a bridge, not a liability. At some point, something happened. A conversation that went terribly wrong, a vulnerability that was turned against them, a moment where speaking up made everything worse, and that version of themselves started to disappear. They didn't choose to become someone who goes quiet. They became that person in response to a world that didn't feel safe enough for their words.
And here's the question living underneath all of it, the one that rarely gets asked out loud. What would happen if I spoke and it was actually safe? That question scares a lot of people who go silent, not because they don't want the answer, but because they've stopped believing the answer could be good. They've spent so long in environments where speaking up meant risk that even in relationships where it might be safe, the old patterns fire first. The nervous system doesn't wait to check whether this time is different. It already knows what to do. Go still. Wait it out. Say nothing.
The path forward for people in this pattern is not about learning to argue better. It's about something much slower and much harder. It's about learning to believe that their words have a safe place to land. That requires, first, recognizing the pattern for what it is, not a character flaw, not emotional immaturity, but a survival strategy that once made complete sense and may now be costing more than it's protecting. It requires finding, even just once, a conversation where speaking up doesn't end the way it always has before. Not a dramatic breakthrough, not a difficult confrontation, just one moment of saying something true and having it received.
Because people who go silent aren't broken. They aren't cold. They aren't choosing distance over connection. They are people who learned at some point that their voice wasn't safe, and they are carrying that lesson into every room they walk into, even the rooms where it no longer applies. The silence isn't the problem. The silence is the symptom. And beneath it, almost always, is someone who has more to say than anyone around them realizes. Someone who is still waiting, not for permission exactly, but for proof. Proof that this time the words won't be used against them. Proof that conflict doesn't have to end in damage. Proof that they are allowed to take up space without something being taken from them in return. That proof is what changes things. Not an ultimatum, not pressure to open up. Just safety, offered consistently, until the silence, finally, has somewhere else to go.